Welcome to Break and Build. I am Muniba Mazari. Let me tell you something right now. The world has been playing chess. But India just flipped the whole damn board. See, for years, for decades, there's been this invisible script being passed around quietly in Washington, D.C. A strategy, a playbook, a way to dominate the battlefield without even stepping foot on it. They call it diplomacy. They call it strategy, but what it really is control. And you know what India did? India just read that script out loud on the world stage in front of everybody and burned it. This ain't the old India. This ain't the country that just sat at the back of the room, nodded politely, and signed whatever papers the West threw on the table. Nah, that India is gone. This new India, this is the India that looks you dead in the eye, flips through your strategy like it's last week's newspaper, and calls out the whole damn plot twist. Because here's what nobody wants to admit. America's war strategy ain't just about weapons. It ain't just about tanks or drones or missiles that can fly halfway across the planet. No, it's about influence. It's about planting the seed of war in other people's soil, and then watering it with promises, deals, and pressure. It's about turning allies into pawns, conflicts into profit, and nations into battlegrounds that America never has to clean up after. And for a long time, that strategy worked until India stepped in. See, India didn't expose the U with guns or accusations. India exposed the US with logic, with leadership, with the audacity to say, we ain't playing by your rules anymore. And India's silent intelligently open, because when people listen not, because it shouts but, because its silence has weight, its restraint has power, and its wisdom, and that wisdom Zimmerman for break it down for you, while the US was trying to pull countries into its own web of strategic war. You'll the wars anymore, strategic war. Her offering defense packs here, stirring tensions there, throwing sanctions like candy at a parade. India was watching, quiet, calculating, waiting, not reacting. Because India knows that real power don't come from reacting. It comes from choosing when to respond and how. And when India responded, it didn't pull out missiles. It pulled out truth. The truth that the so-called rules-based order was really a playbook with one author and a whole lot of signatures at the bottom. The truth that war has become a business and peace, just another PR campaign. The truth that alliances are less about trust and more about leverage. India called that out. India said, we see you. We see the pattern. You provoke. You fund. You sell arms and then you show up as the savior. You set the fire, then sell the water. And the whole world turned around and said, damn, they're right. See, America's strategy has always been to divide and conquer. Create enough chaos so you can step in as the hero. Split the world into teams. Good vs evil, democracy vs dictatorship, east vs west. And in that confusion, they secure control. But India said, we ain't picking a side, we are the side. A side of peace, of power, of principle. America's old strategy. Exposed, and that, my friends, scared the hell out of the playmakers. You know why? Because India can't be bought. It can't be bullied. It can't be baited into a war it didn't start. While other nations folded under pressure, India stood tall and told both East and West, we don't move on commands. We move on conviction. America didn't expect that. The world didn't expect that. They thought India was just another voice in the choir. But India turned out to be the conductor. Let me take you back a little. When conflict broke out in different corners of the world and America came knocking, whispering its strategic suggestions into the ears of allies, most countries nodded. They accepted the terms. They signed the deals. They aligned with the correct side because they were scared not to. But India didn't nod. It didn't shake. It listened. And then it walked its own path. Not east, not west, but forward. And here's where the exposure really happened. When the US started asking, why won't you condemn this? Why won't you support that? Why won't you join our coalition, our campaign, our crusade? India replied with a question of its own. Why do you always need a war to lead? Boom. That one sentence right there that shattered the room, because it wasn't just a question. It was a mirror and the reflection wasn't pretty. See, America's strategy works best when the world is scared. When there's chaos, psychological warfare tactics broken down, when people are forced to choose between bombs and bread. But India said, we don't need fear to lead. We lead from clarity, not confusion. While America offered deals laced with dependency, India offered partnerships based on dignity. While America said with us or against us, India said we walk with whoever walks for peace. Now don't get me wrong, India ain't soft. India ain't naive. India has missiles that can split the sky and turn an enemy base to dust before lunch. But India don't flaunt that because real strength doesn't have to shout. Real strength just shows up calm, ready and unshaken in this new India. It's showing up everywhere in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in global summits where the old powers used to dominate. And it's not just showing up with words. It's showing up with action, with infrastructure, with innovation, with intelligence. That's what exposed the American war strategy, not by fighting it, but by outgrowing it. Because here's the truth, war is old business. It's dirty business. And India is playing a new game, a game of progress. A game of unity, a game that doesn't need enemies to justify its existence. So when the world asked why is India neutral, they misunderstood the whole thing. India ain't neutral. India is aligned to truth, to vision, to a future where power don't come from destruction but from creation. America wants the world to choose a side India's masterstroke moment, but India became the side that people want to be on, not because it's safer, but because it makes sense. And that right there, that's the crack in the wall. Because once you show the world that they don't have to choose between two superpowers, that there's another way, that there's a model of strength without conflict, influence without imposition, defense without aggression, the old system starts crumbling, and America ain't used to that. See, for so long their war strategy was invisible, hidden behind diplomacy, buried under headlines, camouflaged by good intentions. But India took a flashlight to it and said, "We see the blueprint. And we're not playing architect in your war games." The result. Suddenly, countries started asking questions they were too afraid to ask before. Leaders began wondering if maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to rely on the old empire's protection. They could rely on themselves, on their people, on new alliances. Alliances that India was more than willing to build. India is not trying to build an empire. India is trying to build a balance. And that's more dangerous to the old powers than any missile ever could be. Because when you break someone's illusion, you don't just take away their control, you take away their confidence. And right now, the confidence of that old American strategy, it's shaking. Not because India attacked it, but because India outgrew it. That's power, that's leadership, that's revolution without a war. India showed the world that peace is not passive. Peace is a position, it's a discipline. It's a decision you make every single time someone tries to pull you into chaos. And it's a decision America didn't see coming. They thought they could pressure India into taking sides, but India made a side of its own. They thought they could isolate India, but India became the bridge. They thought they could offer deals India couldn't refuse, but India refused to be defined by deals. That's how you expose a strategy. Not with shouting, not with spy satellites and surveillance game sanctions, not with threats, with calm, with courage, with conviction. America's war strategy was designed for a world that no longer exists. A world where information was controlled, where fear was currency, where alliances were made behind closed doors. But this new world, this India moment, it's transparent, it's bold, it's unafraid to say, we see through the game and we're choosing something better. Because here's what the war strategists didn't understand. India has lived through centuries of invasions, of betrayals, of exploitation. So manipulation, it don't work here no more. Not on this soil, not on this generation. India ain't trying to be the next America. It's trying to be the first India. A nation that doesn't need to drop bombs to make an impact. A nation that lifts other nations instead of breaking them. A nation that can sit at the table and say, we're not asking for permission. We are setting the agenda. And once that shift happens, there's no going back. Because the moment you expose the war strategy, you expose the fear behind it. And fear only works when people don't understand their own strength. India is showing the world its strength. Not with tanks, not with troops, but with truth. And that, my friends, is what America never saw coming. India just proved you don't need a battlefield to win. You just need to stop playing the wrong game. The world didn't realize it was being manipulated until India quietly walked out of the trap. And that's the thing about manipulation. It's only powerful when the people inside it don't recognize the walls. You see, for decades, global politics was being played like a grand illusion show. There were bright lights, big speeches, battlefield without bullets, the cyber war powerful alliances, and thunderous applause. But behind that stage was a web of control layered with intentions no one ever spoke about out loud. The world was led to believe they were acting out of principled morality and peacekeeping when in truth many of the moves being made were orchestrated to serve one center of gravity. One that quietly benefited from every new conflict, every arms deal, and every unstable region that cried for foreign aid. India watched this game long enough. It observed, it listened, and it participated just enough to avoid suspicion. But India was never fully in. It knew the trap was always dressed in velvet. It knew that terms like strategic partnership and coalition building often translated to "we pull the strings and you dance." And for many countries, they danced not because they wanted to, but because they didn't see a way out. The fear of isolation, of sanctions, of diplomatic cold shoulders kept them in line. The illusion was powerful because it wore the mask of democracy, the cloak of peace, and the vocabulary of unity. But unity doesn't come through dominance. Peace doesn't bloom from pressure, and democracy doesn't exist where voices are bullied into silence. India understood that. But more than understanding it, India's diplomatic counterattack planned its own exit quietly. It didn't announce a revolution. It didn't break alliances with fireworks. It simply started making different decisions, ones that made no sense to the old world order. While other nations were rushing to join military blocs, India held back. While pressure was mounting to pick sides in global conflicts, India chose a third road, one of strategic autonomy. And when the question came, why is India not aligning with us? The answer wasn't loud. It wasn't confrontational. It was just Indian patient measured, sovereign India's silence said more than 1,000 press conferences could. It wasn't the sound of fear. It was the sound of calculation. While others rushed into chaos under the banner of unity, India sat still and watched where the dominoes would fall. It had seen this pattern before. A crisis begins. Media narratives are launched. Moral positions are dictated from podiums, and then the economic machinery kicks in. Weapons are sold, loans are offered, reconstruction plans are floated, and all the while the same group of countries benefit. It's a cycle as old as modern warfare itself, and India saw through it. But the genius of India's move was not just walking out of the trap. It was doing it so gracefully. No one noticed until the silence became louder than the noise. It started creating new trade corridors. It deepened ties with nations that weren't part of the Western orbit. It offered development without conditions, cooperation without coercion. Countries began to see the contrast. One power, how India beat the trap quietly, offered military aid with strings attached. The other offered digital infrastructure and vaccine partnerships with no political price tag. One power forced choices. The other allowed independence. That shift in behavior exposed everything. Because when India made these moves, it didn't do it with arrogance. It didn't wave a flag saying, "Look what we've discovered." It just quietly stopped playing the game. And the world took notice. Suddenly leaders from Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and South America began looking to New Delhi not just as a capital, but as a compass. They saw a country that refused to be bullied and still thrive, a country that didn't beg for approval and still earned respect, and most of all, a country that broke away from the old model and somehow built a better one. India wasn't just redefining its role. It was redefining the rule, and that's what exposed the manipulation. Because if one country can walk away from the trap and rise higher, because of it, then the question becomes who else has the courage to do the same. India's quiet eggs, it became a mirror. It showed other nations that they weren't standing on solid ground. They were standing on a foundation built by someone else for someone else. And that realization that's dangerous to the old powers, not because India is attacking them, but because India is giving others permission to think for themselves. You have to understand how deep this manipulation goes. It wasn't just political. It was psychological. Countries were made to feel that they couldn't survive without Western protection, that their economies would collapse without IMF loans, that their militaries were weak unless armed by foreign powers. But India's rise proved that self-reliance isn't just possible, it's powerful. It showed that strength doesn't always come from aligning with giants. Sometimes it comes from standing alone. And standing alone is exactly what India did on the world stage under a world waking up too late pressure during crisis when everyone expected it to fold. But instead of folding, it stood taller. And as it stood, it began to unveil a new form of diplomacy. One based not on hierarchy, but on partnership, not on favors, but on fairness, not on fear, but on freedom. It was subtle, but it was revolutionary. And here's where it gets even more real. The manipulation worked because it was dressed as protection. like a friend who says, "I'm only doing this for your own good," while holding the leash tighter. The old powers said they were protecting freedom, but in reality they were maintaining influence. They said they were promoting democracy, but only the kind that bowed to their interests. India didn't scream back. It simply started defining its own terms. And when you define your own terms, you expose the ones who were trying to control you. The walkout wasn't loud, but it was loud enough for others to feel it. In diplomatic rooms, India's independence began to reshape the agenda. In defense summits, its refusal to sign lopsided deals raised eyebrows. In trade talks, its insistence on mutual benefit rewrote the contracts. And little by little, the manipulation began to crumble. Because the moment someone escapes the trap without burning bridges, others start looking for the exit too. The West had built an entire system where dependency was the currency. You want development, here's a loan. Pay it back with interest and obedience. You want security, here's a weapons deal. But don't you dare disagree with our policies. You want trade access, then align your votes with us at the UN. It was all dressed in diplomacy, but it was domination. India didn't buy it, it built its own alternatives. It joined alliances that respected sovereignty. It launched projects that empowered others. It offered partnerships without lectures. And in doing so, it exposed that you don't need to be a puppet to be successful. You don't need to be loud to motivation, to think differently, be powerful. You just need to be rooted in purpose and patient enough to wait for the world to notice. The world is noticing now. India's quiet departure from the manipulation machine is making more noise than any protest ever could, because it's not just a rejection. It's a replacement. It's a new way of engaging. And that's what unsettles those who designed the old script. Not because India is aggressive, but because India is proving that peace, strength, and sovereignty are not mutually exclusive. Other nations are waking up to this too. The fog is lifting. The illusion is cracking because once you see the trap, you can't unsee it. Once you see India thriving outside of it, you start to question whether you were ever free inside it. India didn't declare war on the manipulation. It just stopped feeding it. And when you stop feeding a system that relies on your obedience, that system starts starving. That's what's happening now. And that is where the true brilliance of India lies, not in how loud it speaks, but in how deeply it is heard. In a world that has been spun into chaos through strategies of division, dependency, and deception, India didn't raise a fist. It raised a mirror that showed the world its own reflection. And when the illusion cracked, what was revealed was not just a new path for India, but a new path for the world. A path where strength is not measured by the number of bombs you can drop, but by the number of bridges you can build. A path where leadership doesn't mean commanding others, but inspiring them to stand on their own. India didn't ask for permission to lead, it simply led. By example, by integrity, by unwavering belief in the dignity of self-reliance. That belief didn't just change India's future, it began to shift the very architecture of global influence. Because once one nation proves that sovereignty is not a liability but a strength, others begin to realize they too can rise without bowing. They too can choose their own rhythm, their own alliances, their own voice. The fear that once ruled diplomatic halls began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet but powerful sense of possibility. And while the old powers continue to play by the same playbook, trying to force a game that no longer captivates, India is writing a new one where nations are not pawns but partners, where development is not bait but a bond, where peace is not an afterthought, but the foundation. That kind of transformation doesn't come easy. It comes with patience, with purpose, with sacrifice. But it lasts, because it's not built on pressure. It's built on principles. India has become more than a country on the map. It has become a mindset, a symbol of what's possible when a nation refuses to be manipulated, refuses to be cornered, and instead carves out a space so grounded, so focused, that it pulls others toward it, not with force, but with gravity. That is the revolution the world didn't expect. A revolution without a battlefield, a resistance without rage, a new power rising not by challenging others, but by challenging the old assumptions that ruled global affairs for decades. So when the dust settles and the new global order begins to take form, it will not be shaped by who shouted the loudest or who threw the first punch. It will be shaped by those who stood firm, who chose clarity over confusion, sovereignty over submission, peace over pressure. And at the center of that transformation, the world will find India unshaken, unapologetic, and undeniably leading a new era. Not just by changing the game, but by walking away from it altogether and showing us all there was always a better way.